focus this afternoon. We're live there now.
Если уж что и представляет угрозу миру, так это беззастенчивые и агрессивные действия США и их союзников, направленные на свержение законно избранного президента Венесуэлы. По сути, у нас на глазах бесцеремонно, с нарушениями всех норм международного права,
norms of international law, an attempt by Washington to engineer a coup d'etat in this country. And this situation about which we will no doubt hear the views of the people of Venezuela and Latin American states, this situation the Council is supposed to consider as a supposed threat to Venezuela. In this connection, we request putting the issue the agenda about which we're supposed to hold a meeting up for a procedural vote. We do not agree with the item situation in Venezuela, especially since there is no such item on the agenda of the Security Council. In our view, it would be right to conduct a discussion on an item threat to international peace and security, violation of Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. We call on all who share our point of view to support us. Thank you.
Does any other member of the Council wish to take the floor? I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Michael Pompeo, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. President. The focus of the UN Security Council is to safeguard international peace and security. The former Maduro regime has oppressed its people for years, forcing millions of Venezuelans to flee the country merely to gain very basic access to food and water. This has overwhelmed the capacity of regional countries to adequately address urgent humanitarian needs. Former President Maduro bears full responsibility for this tragedy, allowing Venezuelans to languish without food and humanitarian assistance. On January 10th, the OAS passed a resolution that refused to recognize the illegitimate Maduro regime and called for further attention to address the suffering of the Venezuelan people. Last week, we all received a letter under Article 54 from OAS Secretary General Luis Almagro, which specifically described the destabilizing impact of this crisis in the region. And yet, despite this tragedy, despite the calls from regional bodies for more attention, the United Nations has yet to hold a formal session on this subject. Now we have a new leader, Juan Guaido, in Venezuela, who has promised to bring elections and constitutional order back to Venezuela and security back to the region. We cannot delay this critical conversation, which has the world's attention. For the sake of Venezuela and the region, we must support the Venezuelan people and do so right now. Thank you.
My thanks to His Excellency Mr. Pompeo for his statement. In view of the request and the comments made by members of the Security Council, I intend to put the provisional agenda to the vote. Accordingly, I shall put it to the vote now. Will those in favor of the adoption of the provisional agenda, the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 9 votes in favor, 4 votes against, 2 abstentions. As a result of the vote, the provisional agenda has been adopted.
Provisional ha sido aprobado.
So I reiterate that the provisional agenda has been adopted.
De conformidad con el artículo 30.
In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Argentina, Barbados, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominica, Ecuador, El Salvador, the plurinational state of Bolivia, Mexico, Nicaragua, Paraguay, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname and Uruguay to participate in this meeting.
Así queda.
It is so decided.
De conformidad con el
In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under Secretary General for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided.
El Consejo de Seguridad.
The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the situation in Venezuela is cause for serious concern. The protracted crisis in the country has had a grave impact on the population, with high levels of political polarization, growing humanitarian needs, and serious human rights concerns. And the economic situation in the country has become dire. Repeated efforts to bring the government and opposition to the negotiating table have not led to concrete agreements. The Secretary General has consistently stated the need for a credible and inclusive political process that has the interests of the Venezuelan people at heart. The situation has both an economic and political dimension. The population is affected in a systemic way. Nearly all 30 million Venezuelans are affected by hyperinflation and a collapse of real salaries, shortages of food, medicine, and basic supplies, deterioration of health and education services, deterioration of basic infrastructure such as water, electricity, transport, and urban services, drastic reduction in production capacities in the agricultural, pharmaceutical, and other sectors have aggravated the supply situation. The drop in oil prices recorded in recent years continued in 2018, with a decrease of about 500,000 barrels per day from 2017 and a consequent fall in revenues. The International Monetary Fund reported the inflation rate hit 1.37 million% last year and projected real GDP in 2019 of negative 18%. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, between 2015 and 2017, there were 3.7 million undernourished people in the country. Infant mortality rates doubled in recent years. According to UN estimates, over 3 million Venezuelans are now living abroad, including some 2.3 million who've left the country since 2015, going mostly to other South American countries. Mr. President, in the parliamentary elections of December 2015, the opposition won a large majority of seats in the National Assembly. Subsequently, the Supreme Court ruled that the Assembly was in contempt and that all its actions were null and void. In 2017, a National Constituent Assembly was established through elections in which the opposition parties did not participate. The National Constituent Assembly took over key functions of the legislative branch and undertook a process of constitutional reform that remains inconclusive and is not recognized by the opposition parties. Attempts to bring about political dialogue started as early as May 2016 through an initiative facilitated by 3 former presidents from the Dominican Republic, Panama, and Spain under the auspices of the Union of South American Nations. Despite some initial progress, no concrete agreements were reached through this initiative, which was suspended by the beginning of 2017. By mid-2017, there were efforts to resume dialogue, and formal talks began in September 2017, hosted by the Dominican Republic and with international accompaniment. Talks ended without agreement on February 2018. One of the major areas of disagreement was the electoral calendar and guarantees to ensure free, transparent, and credible elections. Subsequently, the government went ahead with presidential elections in May 2018. President Nicolas Maduro was declared the winner over 2 other candidates. Most of the opposition did not participate in the elections or recognize the results. On 10 January, Nicolas Maduro was sworn in as president for a second 6-year term. On 23 January, large-scale opposition protests culminated with Juan Guaido, president of the opposition-led National Assembly, announcing that he did not recognize President Maduro or his government. Mr. Guaido proclaimed himself interim president, pledging to form a transitional government and call for elections. While the protests were largely peaceful, there were incidents of violence. The Secretary General has expressed strong concern over reports of casualties among demonstrators and has called for transparent and independent investigation of these incidents. According to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, credible local sources have reported that at least 20 people have died in the unrest. Many more have been reportedly injured and detained in violent incidents. The High Commissioner stated yesterday, any violent incident resulting in death or injury should be subject to an independent and impartial investigation to find out whether there was excessive use of force by the authorities or if crimes have been committed by members of armed groups, pro-government or otherwise. I am extremely concerned, she said, that the situation in Venezuela may rapidly spiral out of control with catastrophic consequences. The High Commissioner also stressed that it is of utmost importance to uphold the right to peaceful assembly and refrain from excessive, disproportionate, and indiscriminate use of force. Mr. President, in a statement on 24 January, the Secretary General emphasized the urgency for all relevant actors to commit to inclusive and credible political dialogue to address the protracted crisis in the country with full respect for the rule of law and human rights. He has offered his good offices to help resolve the crisis. The main concern is the well-being of the Venezuelan people and their ability to enjoy their full rights. The UN has been providing assistance, particularly in the areas of health and nutrition, and the Secretary General had asked the International Organization for Migration and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to establish a mechanism to support Venezuelans leaving the country. IOM and UNHCR appointed Mr. Eduardo Stein, former Vice President of Guatemala, as their joint representative to work with regional governments to ensure that support is in place to these individuals. As the Secretary General has stated, in this crucial moment, it is important that all actors exercise maximum restraint to avoid an escalation of violence and confrontation. There are divergent visions of what the future should hold for Venezuela, but we must all be guided by the pursuit of the well-being of the Venezuelan people and work together so that their needs are fully met. We must do all we can to prevent a worsening of tensions. And we must try to help bring about a political solution that will allow the country's citizens to enjoy peace, prosperity, and all their human rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Gracias, señora.
Thank you, Madam DiCarlo, for your briefing. Now I will give the floor to members of the council who wish to make statements. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Michael Pompeo, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Good morning. On behalf of President Trump and the American people, I first want to thank Foreign Minister Miguel Vargas of the Dominican Republic, the current president of the Security Council, for scheduling this meeting. My former colleague, Ambassador Haley, lobbied for a year to get the council to address Venezuela, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. This meeting is long overdue. And you all know why it's overdue. Take Carlos Aquino, a 37-year-old construction worker, weeping over the tiny coffin of his deceased infant son who had died of starvation. Such scenes of misery are now the norm in Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela, where millions of children are suffering from malnutrition and starvation, thanks to a socialist experiment that caused the economy to collapse. This human misery isn't a secret. Stories like this one are well documented by our press corps. You can read about men like Carlos every day. People like him are why the United States has called this meeting. We're here because Maduro has reduced ordinary Venezuelans who once lived in prosperity to rooting through dumpsters to find something to eat. We're here because scores of Venezuelan women, some of them teenagers, have fled Maduro's madness to other countries and in desperation turned to prostitution to survive. We're here because of Maria Vilema, a school psychologist who said through tears, "We have a government that is dedicated to destroying, not to constructing." Another man, a farmer, named Vladimir Sequeira, who never got more than a 6th grade education, but he hoped that his stepdaughter Gabriela could fulfill her dreams of being a lawyer. She now says, "Our whole future has been taken away." That future, for her and all Venezuelans, didn't magically disappear on its own. The Maduro regime's failed policies, oppression, and corruption stole that future. The United States is helping to recover a brighter future for Venezuela. We're here to urge all nations to support the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people as they try to free themselves from former President Maduro's illegitimate mafia state. The humanitarian situation demands action now. It demands action today. Today, 9 out of 10 citizens live in poverty. Millions lack access to drinking water and food. 3 out of 4 hospitals have been abandoned. 3 million Venezuelans have been forced to flee their homeland, thereby flooding the region and threatening international peace and security. Maduro's prisons are full of political prisoners unjustly behind bars, and the graveyards hold dissidents and protesters that have been killed by this regime. I want to talk to you about just one of them, a member of the City Council of Caracas named Fernando Alban. Just 4 months ago, he came here to the city to meet with the world's representatives who gather here every year during the United Nations General Assembly. He came here to speak about the failures of the Maduro regime and about his hopes for a more democratic and a more prosperous future for his country. After that, he went home. He went home to the country that he loved. Maduro's secret police arrested him at the airport as soon as he landed. He died in their custody 3 days later, and the pathetic explanations for this death have convinced absolutely no one. The time is now to support the Venezuelan people, to recognize the new democratic government led by Interim President Guaido, and end this nightmare. No excuses. The United States stands with the Venezuelan people. So far, many other nations have chosen to do the same, and they too have recognized the legitimate government of Interim President Guaido. The United States stands proudly with you as we stand together in support of Venezuela. You knew the Venezuelan people did not have a moment to spare. And now it's time for every other nation to pick a side. No more delays, no more games. Either you stand with the forces of freedom, or you're in league with Maduro and his mayhem. Some countries have publicly taken former President Maduro's side. China, Russia, Syria, and Iran are just 4 of them. Just this morning, We tried to find a way for this council to speak in one voice in support of the Venezuelan people and the democratic ideals through a presidential statement on this council. But our Russian and Chinese colleagues refused to let this move forward. It's not a surprise that those who rule without democracy in their own countries are trying to prop up Maduro while he is in dire straits. Nor are these countries supporting international norms, as they cynically claim. China and Russia are propping up a failed regime in the hopes of recovering billions of dollars in ill-considered investments and assistance made over the years. This money was never intended to help the Venezuelan people. It lined the pockets of the Maduro regime, its cronies, and its benefactors. But no regime has done more to sustain the nightmarish condition of the Venezuelan people than the regime in Havana. For years, Cuban security and intelligence thugs, invited into Venezuela by Maduro himself and those around him, have sustained this illegitimate rule. They've trained Maduro's security and intelligence henchmen in Cuba's own worst practices. Cuba's Interior Ministry even provides former President Maduro's personal security. Members of this body often use their microphones here to condemn foreign interference in internal affairs. Let's be crystal clear. The foreign power meddling in Venezuela today is Cuba. Cuba has directly made matters worse. And the United States and our partners are the true friends of the Venezuelan people. On Wednesday, the Venezuelan people chose to take their country back on the anniversary of the day the dictator Marcos Jimenez Pérez was forced out of power back in 1958. We call for Venezuelans to work now, together, to peacefully restore the constitutional government and return the country to a secure, democratic, and prosperous path. As we read reports of peaceful Venezuelan protesters killed or wounded, we also repeat our insistence that Venezuela's security services show restraint. And I want to be 100% clear. President Trump and I fully expect that our diplomats will continue to receive protections provided under the Vienna Convention. Do not test the United States on our resolve to protect our own people. We hope that the international community will support the people of Venezuela and the transitional government led by Juan Guaido. On January 23rd, Guaido declared himself interim president of Venezuela in accordance with Venezuela's own constitution. He made this declaration with the full support of the National Assembly and of the Venezuelan people. Our nations must stand up for the rule of law and support the leader who the Venezuelan people have affirmed as their legitimate interim president. It is our hope that free and fair elections happen as soon as possible. Back in 1961, President Kennedy spoke in Caracas. He declared, quote, "We will be partners in building a better life for our people." America's ambition has not changed since that day. We stand with the Venezuelan people as they seek to build a better life for themselves, and we cannot ignore the suffering or tyranny taking place in this proud nation. Neither should other countries who care about freedom and prosperity. Today we call on all members of the Security Council to support Venezuela's democratic transition and interim President Guaido's role in it. Thank you.
Doy las gracias al excelentísimo señor Pompeo por...
I thank His Excellency Mr. Pompeo for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency Sir Alan Duncan, Minister of State for Europe and the Americas of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting. There are probably only a few moments in history when a country's rate of inflation has to be measured in millions of percent. But in the case of Venezuela, this is such a moment. And beneath that stark statistic rests a scene of total economic collapse, and with it, a comprehensive picture of human misery and degradation from which only the corrupt Venezuelan elite are able to escape. People are starving, children are malnourished, essential items are absent from the bare shelves of bankrupt stores, and from this wretchedness, millions have fled to seek refuge in neighboring countries where they have been rescued by an outpouring of human generosity. Now, this excusable and wholly avoidable wasteland, Mr. President, is entirely the creation of one man and his cronies. The ranting socialism of Nicolas Maduro has destroyed an entire country, and despite his self-congratulatory moral posturing, his enduring legacy will be to have made the poor not just poorer, but destitute. And it's our concern for the plight of Venezuela and the country's people that motivates us here today, not the sentiments of anything that can possibly be described as colonial. How indeed can any self-respecting government possibly justify supporting the poisonous regime of the nation-destroying Mr. Maduro? But in addition to holding the opinion we do because of our concern for the people of Venezuela, this United Nations and we, the Security Council, are also here to resolve the world's worst sins. And to do so, we must all uphold the rule of law, which we firmly believe should govern the affairs of all. And that rule of law has collapsed in Venezuela. Worse, it has been continuously eroded, undermined, and eradicated by the dictatorial abuses of Nicolas Maduro. And hand in hand with the economic devastation caused by this man has come the parallel removal of liberty, justice, and freedom. We have seen the theft from the Venezuelan people of its democracy. Maduro has attempted to delegitimize the National Assembly. He has created the artificial and illegitimate Constituent Assembly, and he has ruthlessly put an end to free and fair elections by stuffing ballot boxes and corrupting democratic decision. The political opposition has been suppressed and intimidated. Its leaders have fled or been imprisoned. And we will never forget that the opposition activist Fernando Albán, mentioned just now by Secretary Pompeo, was detained and then found dead beneath the windows of the National Intelligence Facility. Now, the world can now see that the presidency of Nicolas Maduro no longer rests on democratic foundations. The presidency of Nicolas Maduro is not legitimate. And we, the UK, unreservedly praise and support the extraordinary courage of Juan Guaido in his stand against Maduro's fraud, corruption, and undemocratic status. We applaud Juan Guaido's decision to assert the legitimate authority of the National Assembly. Mr. President, it is therefore right that we should now respond robustly to the courageous steps taken by the Venezuelan people and the political opposition by bringing this critical issue here to the Security Council. Council members must recognize their responsibility to ensure that the UN uses its leadership to help achieve positive change in Venezuela. Our efforts must now focus on finding a way out of the crisis that has devastated the country. So, Mr. President, let me make our position clear. The UK stands with the EU in demanding urgent, free and fair elections at the earliest opportunity and in calling for a legitimate government to be established. We stand with the Organization of American States, and we stand with the Lima Group, whose members last September referred the Venezuelan government to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, citing over 8,000 extrajudicial executions, 12,000 arbitrary arrests, and the detention of 13,000 political prisoners. They made history by making it the first ever case in which an entire state has been referred to the ICC. And, Mr. President, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States in saying that the National Assembly and its President Juan Guaido are best placed to lead Venezuela to the restoration of its democracy, its economy, and its freedom. Therefore, we believe that Juan Guaido is the right man to take Venezuela forward, and we will recognize him as constitutional interim president if new elections are not announced within 8 days. We should today all stand together against the tyranny of Nicolas Maduro and in support of legitimate democratic forces in Venezuela. Venezuela can and must recover from the depths of its current despair. To do so, it needs an end to tyranny, an end to corruption, and an urgent return to freedom, democracy and the rule of law. This Security Council must make its view clear, and we must urgently help pave the way to a brighter future for the Venezuela which Maduro has so culpably ruined. Thank you, sir.
Gracias al excelentísimo.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Duncan for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Peru. Thank you, President. We are grateful for the convening of today's meeting, and we also appreciate the invaluable information that's been shared with us by Ms. Di Carlo. We particularly welcome the presence with us this morning in the Security Council of senior officials who are attending this meeting this morning. We believe it's important that the Security Council does indeed proceed to discuss the situation in Venezuela under Article 34 of the Charter of the United Nations, an article which authorizes the Security Council to address any situation that might imperil the maintenance of international peace and security. Such a step of discussing this issue is also a representative of our commitment to preventive diplomacy, which is a duty of this Council. Peru notes with alarm that the breakdown of constitutional order in Venezuela has unleashed a serious political, economic and humanitarian crisis, which represents a threat to regional peace and security. The policy of repression pursued by the illegitimate regime of Nicolas Maduro targeting his own people has fueled the prospects for fresh escalations of violence, the consequences of which this Council must prevent and address in line with our solemn responsibilities. The reality faced by the Venezuelan people that some countries are seeking to depict as a purely internal matter is that of the ongoing massive and historic exodus of around 3.3 million persons, the direct result of the anti-democratic, oppressive and dictatorial acts and policies of the Maduro regime. Conservative estimates indicate an increase of 2 million over that figure of 3.3 million persons in the short term, given the escalation in violence and the escalation of the humanitarian crisis which is currently racking the country. We wish to underscore the extent to which the rapidity and the complexity of this phenomenon has been impacting and shaping a situation of crisis and tension at the regional level, which several countries, including my own, have had to respond to on the fly in order to provide for the most basic needs of this newly created diaspora. Peru alone has received to date some 700,000 refugees, and I wish to repeat that figure. 700,000 Venezuelan refugees and migrants have been welcomed and supported by Peru to date. President, the humanitarian crisis and the political crackdown in Venezuela are not recent. The Secretary General of the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations have found that evidence exists that confirms the systematic and strategic use of murder, imprisonment, torture, and rape and other forms of sexual violence, all for the purpose of cowing and terrorizing the Venezuelan people and for the purpose of crushing opposition to the regime. Given the fact that such serious crimes have occurred, in September of last year, Peru, together with Argentina, Canada, Chile, Colombia, and Paraguay, invoking Article 14 of the Rome Statute, requested the prosecutor of the ICC to begin an investigation into crimes against humanity committed by the Maduro regime in Venezuela since the 12th of February 2014. The political and security crises have worsened since the illegitimate seizure of power by Nicolas Maduro, a taking of power based on an electoral process that failed to meet minimum international standards in terms of participation, justice, transparency, and international observation, standards that need to be met as a prerequisite for elections to be considered democratic, free, fair, and credible. For said reason, the Lima Group, a mechanism comprising states of the region, the purpose of which is to seek a peaceful solution to the situation in Venezuela, did not recognize the legitimacy of the electoral process that took place on the 20th of May 2018. The illegitimate nature of the regime is the result, moreover, of an ongoing process of the dismantling of democracy and of fundamental freedoms, a process that goes hand in hand with the reiterated and evident lack of willingness of the aforementioned regime to promote peaceful solutions through dialogue with the opposition. It is painful to see that the response of the dictatorial regime of Nicolas Maduro, in light of the demonstrations of the Venezuelan people that have been the response to this crisis, has been the disproportionate use of violence, political persecution and crackdown, for which reason we once again reiterate our previous appeal for an immediate cessation of violence and for the release of all political prisoners in Venezuela. On this particular point, the High Commissioner for Human Rights has stated that this week her office recorded 180 popular protests that led to loss of life and to widespread detention by the security forces and by pro-governmental armed groups. We require an independent investigation to ensure that those responsible for these actions answer before the courts. Here we would draw attention to the resolution adopted by the Permanent Council of the Organization of American States on the 10th of January, a resolution in which the OAS resolved not to recognize the new regime of Nicolas Maduro, and a resolution in which the OAS called upon its member states to adopt measures that would contribute to the swift restoration of democratic order. This regional position is commensurate with the declaration issued on the 4th of January by the Lima Group, a declaration in which said Lima Group urged Nicolas Maduro to transfer on a provisional basis executive power to the National Assembly until new elections can be held in Venezuela. President, Peru, together with other countries in Latin America and indeed in other regions of the world, has recognized the President of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido, as the interim president of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and has done so in strict adherence to the constitution of the aforementioned nation, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We also uphold the constitutional authority of the National Assembly of Venezuela, which is the only democratically elected body in that country. And we resolutely support the actions adopted by said body, the National Assembly, including its decision to authorize international humanitarian aid. Peru believes that under the leadership of President Guaido, an immediate process of democratic transition must begin, as this represents the only way in which Venezuela can start to climb out of the pit of this protracted and major crisis. This will necessitate the holding of new, democratic, credible and transparent elections that take place in full respect for the rule of law, and elections that respect constitutional guarantees and the fundamental rights of all Venezuelans. Elections that should also ensure unfettered participation and take place under international observation and meeting international standards. Finally, I would like to reiterate our commitment to and solidarity with our brother people of Venezuela, reiterating our willingness to contribute to the restoration of democracy in the aforementioned country. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the representative of Peru. I would now like to give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, we want to thank you for convening today's sessions on the situation in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We also want to welcome numerous ministers present here in the Council today, as well as the briefing by Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo. Mr. President, in any country, like all the countries around this big table, political parties choose the provisions on which to conduct elections. Venezuela is no different, and it held its presidential elections on May 20th, 2018, on the basis of its national laws governing such elections. These elections also took place in accordance with the agreement of electoral guarantees that was signed by political parties shortly before the elections. The elections were further overseen by Venezuelan National Electoral Council like in any other countries, developing countries. It was on this basis that the South African President, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, congratulated President Maduro following his inauguration for the second term as President of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Mr. President, a founding principle of the South African constitutional democracy that we hold very dear is the respect for the rule of law. We are therefore deeply concerned by what is a clear attempt in Venezuela to circumvent the country's constitutional legal mechanisms which govern its elections. Any grievances or dispute should be resolved in a peaceful manner through a proper mechanism and processes provided for in the Constitution of Venezuela and its electoral laws, without external influence. This is a standard practice everywhere by every country, and indeed best practice in all democracies that subscribes to the rule of law. Mr. President, South Africa echoes the statement made by the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, in Davos on the 24th of January 2019, where he urged a de-escalation of tension to prevent further violence. We further support the Secretary General's call for the, I quote, an urgent need for all relevant actors to commit to inclusive, credible political dialogue to address the protracted crisis in the country with full respect for the rule of law and human rights, close quotes. South Africa thus call on all parties to participate in a national dialogue process to ensure unity and reconciliation, and in the furtherance of a political solution of the situation of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. We'd like to reiterate that any further action or grievance by either party should be resolved through due legal processes of the country. We are indeed also concerned about the humanitarian situation in Venezuela and the resultant migration that have taken place. We call all the international community, as well as relevant UN agencies and bodies, to work with the general government and its neighbors to assist in need. Mr. President, I wish to stress that South Africa is firmly against any attempt of undue or unconstitutional change of government of Venezuela. The Security Council should never be an instrument that validates an unconstitutional changes of any government anywhere, anytime. Instead, the Council should promote avenues that create an environment for conclusive, inclusive dialogue, and that cooperation that will ease the challenges and hardships faced by Venezuelan people. I thank you.
I want to thank the representative of South Africa. And I now give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea. Thank you very much, Mr. President. We would like to thank the Undersecretary General of the United Nations for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, for the picture she has painted to us of the current situation of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Mr. President, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea has been following very closely the development of the situation in Venezuela and in particular the sequence of events reported in the media over the past week. Of course, we're very concerned that this may reach a situation that will cause great suffering to the population. Our delegation considers it an urgent priority that all the interested parties refrain from acts of violence and provocation. At the same time, we would like to make an appeal to the government, to the opposition political parties, to civil society, and to the people of Venezuela to arm themselves with courage, wisdom, and resolve to overcome the situation and to find a lasting solution to peace and security based on respect.
Well, you're watching SABC News, and we've been dipping into the United Nations Security Council meeting this afternoon, during which you've just heard Venezuela come expectedly into sharp focus. Now, South Africa, just a few minutes ago, just finished speaking on the electoral legitimacy of President Nicolas Maduro and says they are very concerned by what they call attempts in Venezuela to circumvent the country's constitutional practices. South Africa supports the urgent need for more political dialogue with full respect and regard for human rights. South Africa is calling for a national dialogue process to encourage national reconciliation there. South Africa urges that all disputes in Venezuela be resolved via the legal processes of that country, and it's firmly against any unconstitutional change of government or regime change in Venezuela at this point. Now, in the first few minutes of this session, we saw Russia trying to block this meeting on Venezuela, accusing the United States of plotting a coup against President Nicolas Maduro. But it was not to be, and that Russian bid quickly failed, with 9 out of the 15 Security Council members there agreeing to go on with the session, attended by U.S. Secretary of State, that's Mike Pompeo. Now, a Russian Foreign Ministry statement said earlier this week, I recall, that Washington interference in Venezuela could lead to more lawlessness and bloodshed in that country. As expected, Pompeo called for the recognition of Juan Guaido, the opposition leader, as president. He went on to describe the dire economic and humanitarian situation in Venezuela. Now, the USA, as expected, is hoping to drum up more support for the opposition leader, Juan Guaido, who declared himself president, something that President Nicolas Maduro calls a USA-supported coup. Well, the United Kingdom, we heard earlier from, supports the USA in its push to pave the way for Guaido. Countries still remain divided, though, over the leadership crisis in Venezuela. While many leaders support Guaido, many this week still stand behind President Maduro, describing Maduro's regime as illegitimate. Several countries, now these include the USA, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay and Peru, recognize Guaido as president. Now, countries that support President Maduro include Bolivia, China, Cuba, Nicaragua, Russia, Syria and Turkey. Now, we'll try and dip back into those United Nations proceedings a little bit later on this afternoon. But for now, let's move on to some other news. All right, let's bring you back home. The final weekend of voter registration was not allowed to begin